Welcome to The Key's new podcast, Trust Matters Lessons in Leadership, with me, Ellie Potter. In this series, I'll be speaking to multi-academy trust leaders, sector experts, leadership coaches, and more to hear about their journeys in leadership. You'll gain practical tips and advice and get their insights on some of the biggest topics impacting the education sector right now. In this week's episode, we welcome Frances Akinde, author, expert in SEND education, and the co-founder of BAMED's SEND Hub. I'll be asking Frances about how funding cuts are impacting the quality of SEND support in schools, how trust can better support their SENCOs, and what it truly means to be anti-racist. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to leave us a review or like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. So welcome to the podcast, Frances. Thank you so much for coming on. If you could start right at the start at your education journey and how you got to the place that you are now.
So I've been in education for the last 20 odd years. So I started off as an art teacher. I always say to people, do what you love. So I started off doing art, quickly became head of art in my first year. And then I've just always worked within school leadership from then, and especially with children with special needs. So it's kind of like my thing, just making sure I can put support in place for them. So I was a SENCO, I was an assessment centre lead in an alternative provision. I started doing work in a local authority, which I absolutely loved, but I really missed the kids. So I wanted to get back into school, worked in primary, and then became a head teacher. And then I came out of headship about 2 years ago now, and I work for a local authority as an inspector and advisor. So I support them with their special schools, alternative provisions and things like that. So a really enjoyable job.
And what are some of the challenges working as a head teacher in alternative provision and special schools that people who might be in mainstream education might not realise?
Just senior leadership altogether, is really challenging when you're working within SEND and alternative provision, because you kind of have to balance the needs of the children with the budget and everything else. And you know that they need a more individualized approach. But in your head, you're thinking, right, as the head teacher, what does that look like for my budget? And you really want to give them everything. And especially for children with life-limiting conditions, you're like, I had 2 pupils that passed away in the first year, in the same year. And I was just really grateful that I'd managed to give them all these opportunities in life, because when you've got life-limiting conditions, you might not get those opportunities later on. So that's a real challenge, sticking to your budget, So yeah, that was one of my biggest challenges, I think.
And given your extensive experience, you've probably seen how SEND funding has been cut over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
How have you seen that directly impact the pupils, the staff, the schools that you've worked in?
Everything's gone up, but then the SEN budget hasn't, So we're still getting the same £10,000 base funding that we had 10, 20 years ago, which is not sustainable for, what you need to give your children and young people. I think the difficulty is that there's so many independent and private providers springing up that do attract a lot more funding. Minimally, you'll get about 35 to 55,000 per child. If you're in a maintained school or an academy, you're getting 10,000 as base funding, and then you're asking for top-ups for the rest. So that's a real challenge for schools to be able to balance the budget around that and to get the staff in, because with support staff, they're really not paid enough for what they do. So that's a real challenge, just being able to attract staff that really know what they're doing, that are really passionate about SEN, but then you're able to pay them properly as well. It's really, really difficult.
And I guess there's a recruitment and retention crisis throughout the sector, but especially in the SEN sector.
Yeah.
What are some of the strategies you've seen schools implement to try and get people to apply for the jobs, and then once they're there, to keep them there?
Yeah. You know what? It's about reputation. Some of my schools, they're fully staffed, and they're not really concerned about getting new staff because their reputation is just so strong. Others where they're really struggling with recruitment, they just have rolling adverts, and they'll just keep the advert out and say, right, okay, if somebody applies, they'll just take them there and then, and I think some people make the mistake of thinking, right, well, wait until the summer, wait until this point. You just need to have that advert out continuously. But people are more concerned now about work-life balance and being looked after, And I always say, especially to my SENCOs, I always say to them, they need you more than you need them. So you really have to think when you're in a school, it works both ways. People are not just going to stay anywhere now just for the sake of it. There's so much choice around. So you really have to make sure you're looking after your staff.
And what do you think are some of the biggest challenges that mainstream schools have in making sure that education is inclusive and equal for all?
It starts from the top. If you haven't got a head teacher that's really genuinely inclusive, it's really difficult, and especially with trust, just making sure that you have got that strong sense of belonging and that inclusion as well is really important, and that the ethos in the school is truly inclusive. Some people worry about in terms of the results and things like that, and that's something we need to look at, the Department for Education and Ofsted, to say that people are driven a lot by results because they know that, can ruin the reputation of their school. And sometimes that can put people off accepting the most complex children. But really, when you have like such a welcoming school and you go to a mainstream school that's just getting it right, it's just such a lovely atmosphere. It really teaches your pupils to be really accepting of difference, which is really important. So I would say, just be truly inclusive in everything that you do. Speak to parents, speak to carers, and speak to the young people themselves to make sure you're getting it right for them.
And what would you like to see from the new government when it comes to SEN funding and provision?
I've got a long list.
No, go on, say the list, the wish list.
If I was Secretary of State for Education, I would really put a cap on how much independent schools can charge. I have a couple of schools that I support. They're like £140 million in deficit. How do you get that much in deficit from funding, from SEN funding? And a lot of that is going into independent schools. So I would really get them to look at what that looks like and think about, how they can redistribute the money so that there's like a fairer distribution model for special schools and SEN funding. I'd also think about the EHCP plans and what that looks like, because at the moment we've got this system where you go to one local authority and the support is completely different from another. The local authority I work for, they're one of the few that still have a central team of inspectors and advisors that can go out and support schools and work within trust, maintain schools, everyone, to give them the support they need. And that makes them an outstanding local authority. It's just a shame that there isn't more consistency across the board, because when it comes to SEN, you have to work with the local authority. You don't have a choice, whether you're an academy, whatever type of school it is. So it's thinking, how do we get people to work more closely together?
And how do you think you get people to work more closely together?
It needs to be supportive. So the schools that I work within, it's a supportive approach, not a punitive approach. It's not like the local authority are coming in, oh my gosh. It's thinking about what is it that you need, helping them to think about what's working well for their students, what could be better, and the next steps. And basically, I love my job because I say it's just like magpieing. I'm going to one school, looking at all their fantastic practice and sharing that with another. And it's for the good of the students, so it's just making it better for everyone. And I think that's a really important role for the local authority. But I think, while we've got all these initiatives that don't really support local authorities working within schools, we're kind of like pitted against each other. Academies and trusts are pitted against local authorities. And there needs to be a way that we can work better together, because the children are at the centre of everything that we do at the end of the day. So that's what I'd like to see, us being able to work together for the good of the children.
So with ongoing financial constraints, how do you think trust leaders in their schools can try and creatively address some of those gaps in funding?
Technology. I'm really surprised at the amount of schools that I go to who really haven't embraced technology. And I'm thinking, if you've got a system like Microsoft, you've got all the accessibility tools that you need within that system, and we're not using it in the classroom. I see AI as like a member support staff in their pocket for students, where if you're trying to explain something or a student needs a bit more support with that, they can just speak into like whatever device and say, can you explain to me what this means or what the keywords are, or help me rephrase it or stuff. In terms of work life balance, well-being. Like, technology makes so much difference. So I wish people would embrace it more. I know that there are some trusts who have got like AI leads now, which is amazing. There's a couple of trusts that have like invested in robots like across the board, which are absolutely amazing. So when it comes to that support for TAs and for children, it's there. But people are worried that robots are going to take over and that, TAs are going to be replaced by robots and all these kind of things. But we have to, I think it's this, I was talking to someone about the calculator and he was like, it was the same when the calculator came out. Everyone was like, oh no, we can't have those in the classroom. But we really need to embrace technology and be forward thinking about it. So I would say to everyone, just do a review of your technology. You may have to spend more initially, but it'll save you so much in the long run. And whether we like it or not, people are not attracted to working in schools in the same way that they were, especially support staff. So we have to think, how can we embrace new technologies to support us as well? So yeah.
And in the schools and trusts that you've worked in, what are some of the practical applications that you've seen that someone listening might think, oh, we could try something like that?
Oh gosh, it really depends on the school. And I think this is the mistake new head teachers make when they go into a new school. They're kind of like, right, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to bring to this school. And I always say to people, just sit tight, just observe for the first term and really see what would fit your school. And, I love appreciative inquiry, and it's really old model of like school improvement and planning, but it's just literally what's working well, even better if, and next steps. And you just spend your time speaking to the staff and saying, what is it that you need to? And sometimes it might be something really little. I remember when I did it and when I became a head teacher and I just gave everyone Post-it notes. I mean, now with technology, I'd use like a Microsoft Forms or something, but I just gave everyone Post-it notes in different colors. And I said, what's working well, even better if. Some people said, we need a new basketball hoop, or the coffee machine is costing too much. And I'm like, these are things like I wouldn't have even thought about myself. So I would just say to everyone, ask staff, don't be afraid to get staff involved and just, make sure there's a community feel to your school. And that's really, really important.
And you work with SENCOs a lot as part of your job. It's a role that's really, really difficult. What's your experience like with working with SENCOs, and what do you think are their biggest needs and challenges for people who may be a little bit more detached working at a higher level?
You know what? It's really interesting because we tend to treat SENCOs as overpaid admin staff. And I have to say that, because, you've paid someone a lot of money. They're experts in their fields and they spend most of their money doing paperwork. So I always say to schools, okay, how do you look after your SENCO? What does their well-being look like? How much time do you give them? A lot of SENCOs are not given enough time to do their job. They can't do lesson observations. They can't do learning walks. They're not even included in learning walks. They're not part of the senior leadership team. So in terms of that decision making, they've got no power. Why would you employ someone who's an expert in what they do and not actually listen to them? So I've been running a course with a colleague for the last year called Building Confidence in SENCOs. And it's about basically saying to them, you're a really important person. You need to go back to your senior leadership team and say, this is what I need to do my job. And it's so lovely when people come back and say, I've got an admin assistant now. And it might be someone that works in the office, it might be the receptionist where, a school leader said, you know what, as part of your role, can you support the SENCO? Can you help them with diary management and things like that? And it makes such a difference.
Yeah.
Again, with AI, I'm waiting for AI to help us with EHCP plans and, putting in strategies and things, because you can literally, write a profile for a child, put it in AI, and it will give you loads of strategies to support them. So, but you need to give people the time to be able to put those in place. So time, leadership, listening to them, I would say 3 really important things.
How often do you think trust leaders who might be on the C-suite team should be meeting with their SENCO to speak about the things that are happening in the schools?
Oh gosh, regularly. I mean, if you're not part of the leadership team, you should be speaking to your head teacher at least once a week. It's the same as safeguarding. You should be having a weekly safeguarding meeting. You should be having a weekly meeting with your SENCO. So if you can't do that, it's thinking about how does that feed into trust level improvement? Are you, there's a trust that I'm doing some training with, and they basically survey all their SENCOs. They get all their SENCOs together, twice a year to ask them what it looks like on the ground. And that's so important. Rather than doing like a whole trust meeting with hundreds, thousands of staff sometimes, it's just getting those specialists together and asking them what it is that they need on the ground. It makes a real difference when you have a head teacher that's also been a qualified SENCO and experienced SENCO. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we need to look at, is making sure head teachers are qualified SENCOs. They have that understanding of what that looks like, so that we're not seeing these divisions that we have at the moment. So I think it's really important to have more training for head teachers around SEN.
So you've had experience as being a head teacher and being a SENCO. How would you compare and contrast the two?
I found being a SENCO a lot harder because I didn't have that power to make change, and it's really difficult when you haven't got a SENCO that's part of the leadership team. And I would always say to people, just listen to your SENCOs, make sure you invest in them, in training, and that they're networking. I think this is the biggest problem with SENCOs. You can become really isolated and you feel bad taking time out of school. When you're a school leader, you've got a bit more flexibility with your budget and things. So you can kind of scan the horizon and see what the big issues are coming up. And you can say, right, I'm going to dedicate my budget to that. Some SENCOs don't even have a budget, They don't know how to do assessments accurately. They're not trained assessors. So really basic things like, I'm going to go into something around working memory, but it's really important because working memory is the foundation of a lot of SEN needs. So with people with ADHD, it affects their working memory, things like anxiety, autism, a lot of conditions start with that. But people don't really understand how working memory works and how it affects learning in the classroom. And you can get assessments, you can get observation tools that really help you with that. And it's really simple things like, giving people more time to answer questions, rephrasing things, keywords, visuals. And I'm really surprised at the amount of SENCOs that haven't heard of that. But because they don't go out and network, they don't really belong to organizations that give them the current research around things. So they can become quite isolated. So you really need to give SENCOs time to come out of like their offices and like do have more time for observations, and going out to other schools as well is really important, really important.
And should most trusts, do you think, have a meeting point? So like all the SENCOs are meeting regularly, sharing best practice?
Definitely. I mean, because that's what my role is, In the local authority I work in, we have like about 600 schools. How amazing is that, to be sharing such good practice amongst all these different schools? And sometimes it might literally be, I've got a child, he presents with, autism, but we're really finding he's struggling with different areas. What does that look like? And if you've got a network of SENCOs that are talking to each other, even if it's like a chat facility or something like that, and just sharing good practice, that saves you a lot of heartache along the way, to be honest. And it restores that relationship with parents where you're being proactive rather than reactive. And this is the thing, I think, in SEN, we're too reactive. We're not proactive enough, and that's something that we really need to focus on.
How much do you think that that's impacted by budget, the ability to not be proactive?
You know what? I think it's really easy for us to keep saying budget all the time, but actually it's about understanding. What I would love to have seen with the, head teacher's qualification is a bigger element around SEND. And I would love every head teacher to be a qualified SENCO so they really understand. Sometimes you get head teachers who have got personal experience of SEND through their children or something else like that, or they've been a SENCO previously, and you really see a difference. But sometimes it's like, it's from the lens that you see, and if you haven't got that understanding of SEND, it really makes a difference in terms of, what you think should be implemented in your school. So I would love to see some reforms around SEND qualifications for head teachers as well.
And is that something you think that if a head's listening to this, they could actually do whilst being a head? Or is there the time there
Oh,
to...
you know what? The problem is there isn't much out there,
Yeah.
for head teachers to learn about SEND. And this is the problem. If it was a bigger area around the MPQH, that would really, really help. But in terms of those courses, there's not really much there unless you do the SENCO qualification, which is really hard work
Yeah.
as well. What I found really helpful, I did my SENCO qualification, I did my MPQH, I did my master's, and I found my master's to be the most helpful out of everything. And when you see school leaders that are really invested in continuous education, it makes such a difference because they get to, be out of school with leaders in other settings and stuff and really learning about inclusive practice. And I think that's something that we really need to invest in more. We should be like other countries where we've got school leaders who have got, PhDs and, masters and things like that, who are just real experts around leadership and management as well. So that's something I think we do need to, that is an idea for the government to do.
You're
more
like, add another one onto your wish list.
in professional development, and qualifications for school leaders. Yeah, I'd add that to the list.
I love this list. And what did you actually do your master's in?
Inclusive education.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, absolutely loved it. I'm actually starting another master's because I love learning, and this one is on education and social justice. Because I've found, it's really interesting because I thought inspectors were kind of like, I won't say, but like now that I am one, it's a completely different outlook on what people are like. The inspectors I work with are so socially justice driven, and they generally just want the best for every child. That's what school improvement is about. They're not ego driven about things. It's like, right, how can we support the school to make things better for those children? So I've really got into social justice and thinking, right, how do we advocate more for children that are really struggling in education? How can we, improve education and be part of that reform,
Part of the social justice and inclusive education is looking at things through an equitable lens.
Absolutely, yeah.
How would you define that? And then how does that look in practice?
I think how you described it is perfect because people have this big debate around equity and equality, but equity means that you give people what they need, not necessarily that everyone gets exactly the same thing. And I always say to people, if you meet one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, same with every other neurodivergent condition. You really have to think, what does that individual need? So to me, that's what looking through an equitable lens means. And sometimes you come across school leaders who will say, well, if we give it to that child, we'll have to give it to everyone. I'm like, I wish we lived in a world where we could give everything that somebody needed to them as an individual. And I always remind people of parentis, I'll say it again, locus parentis, because as educators, we are in the place of a parent, but then we don't necessarily treat that child as we would our own. And with our own children, we'd give them everything that they'd need to thrive. But when it comes to other people's children, we're like, well, we can't give it to that child because everybody would be asking for it. Well, actually, you've got the chance to change a child's life and the trajectory of their life by putting things in place that you might not have necessarily put in place for somebody else. And I think that's really important. So I would just ask everyone to just have a think about that and what that would look like.
How does that look when you're analysing your school data? Like, how can you do that through an equitable lens?
So we live in a world full of data, but the importance isn't, having the data, it's what we do with it. And a lot of people don't know how to analyse data themselves. You might have a trust lead who's the data lead, who you get to crunch the numbers and then send you the headline figures. Actually, we need to learn how to analyse that data ourselves so that we can look at those trends ourselves, because there's a lot of bias in data where we pick out the things that attract our eye, but actually we need to look at all kind of outlying figures and everything else around that. A lot of teachers are given data, so they don't actually interact with their own data. They're told, right, put your numbers or your grades into a spreadsheet, blah, blah. That data goes off and then it comes back to you to say, right, you've got these percentages. Actually, we should be giving people time for their own assessments to analyse their own data and really think about that and teaching them what that looks like to analyse data.
And once you have seen that data, what are the next steps to make sure you have quality provision that suits the needs?
Yeah, using it to inform change. Don't just look at data and, get the headline figures for a presentation. What is it that you can use the data for? So, for example, as I said around behavior, if you have a lot of students that haven't achieved their potential, you can see that on your data. Go back and analyze what their journey's been like throughout the year and think about how can you use data to improve systems and processes within your school? And again, as school leaders, it's so important not to think we know everything, and think, well, this is what worked for my children, or this is what worked for me, this is what I'm going to apply to all the thousands of children across my trust. It just doesn't work. And the whole point is that love of learning and that lifelong trajectory, not just getting children through your school. So thinking about how you can use data to really inform change.
And just thinking on a point earlier, if a trust has brought in new SENCOs, maybe after analysing data, thinking we need
Yeah.
more SENCOs, how is the best way to mentor them, bring them into the fold, onboard them to really make sure they feel a part, like you said, of the
Yeah.
culture and feel like they're an important part of the trust?
You know what? It's really hard because a lot of the time when we bring in new staff, we're desperate for them. So it's like, we're like, right, okay, you need to get straight on and get on with it. But really, it's a disservice to everyone. Give them time to get used to the school, used to colleagues within the trust, used to parents. Give them time to have like open meetings with parents, drop-ins and things like that so they can really get to know. Everybody should be doing an action plan. Like every subject should be doing an action plan. And I'm still really flabbergasted when I go into schools and, school leaders, department leaders don't do an action plan for their department. I'm like, how do you know how much budget you need? How do you know your vulnerable groups and things like that? And it sounds, far-fetched to say it, but I'm still seeing schools that don't do that. Give your SENCOs time to put together an action plan and speak to other people around what that should look like, really analyse, their situation within the school.
And another part of equity is looking at obviously race, gender,
Yeah.
protected characteristics. How can trust leaders better address that part of equity and learning?
Again, it's by listening. I think some schools really get it right. They really listen to lived experience. But unfortunately, other schools are really performative. They put things out and it's like, right, okay, this month we're focusing on Black History Month and next month we're focusing on LGBTQ plus rights. And, I know somebody who's really passionate about South Asian History Month. And their head teacher had said, well, we can't do South Asian History Month because we've just done Black History Month, so we really don't have time for it. It's like you really make people feel like the other. If you're really passionate about having an inclusive school where everyone feels like they belong, speak to people, listen to their experiences of how you can get things right. Don't just get people in like me that will make you look good and say, oh, we've got Frances in to do a talk for us and it's a one-off talk, but everything's better. And then write it on your school development plan for when Ofsted come in. That is just so performative. Be really invested in change and making sure that you are listening to people on the ground. So I would say make sure there's regular surveys, anonymous if you need to, so that people really feel like they can say what they need to say, and really listen when people say, this is the experience I've had in the school. When it comes to racism in particular, as soon as schools hear the R word, it's like they get really prickly, like, we're not racist here, we don't have that problem here. Actually just sit on that word and think, right, somebody's telling us there's a problem.
Yeah.
Let's take my own feelings out of it and really speak about what that could look like and analyse that and do better. Don't take it personally, just think about, right, okay, how can we really inform change? So that's the biggest advice I'd give to anyone. Just listen to people with lived experience.
I think a lot of people probably don't understand the concept of being performative and being an ally. Can you just explain a bit more about the difference of those two things?
So when it comes to performative allyship and just basically being a true ally, when you're asking someone if they're okay, it's such an important question. You need to follow through and say, all right, that's good. Okay, see you later then. It's actually taking the time to say, what do you need? How is it that I can support you? And listening to what someone says without it being used against them. I think it's so important. I just want to expand on that a little bit now that I am. one of the schools I work in, they are getting it right. They've got this app that they've brought into where everybody can have this app. They don't have those conversations directly with people. The app, they said, in terms of their staff attendance, it has just improved so much because on the app, it's got a bit of AI in it where people can say, look, this is what I'm struggling with. It'll give them recipes, it'll give them exercises. It will ask them about what they do for mindfulness and things like that. And that's real, true allyship where you've invested in something that your staff will engage with. But at the same time, you've asked staff, does it work for you? And they're like, yeah, it's been brilliant. If they turn around and say, no, it hasn't, then are you going to just keep plugging this app, or are you going to say, right, okay, let's do something different? So asking people, what is it that you need is really important, and taking the time to listen to their answer and act on their answer.
Yeah.
Performative is saying that you're going to do something, but thinking, oh, actually, that's a bit much. I don't want to get myself into trouble, Allyship is good trouble. And Senator John Lewis always used to say, I'm not afraid to get into good trouble. And that's my motto.
I love that phrase, good trouble.
Yeah, that's my motto. Good trouble is important to me because I know that it creates change, and you might be going against what other people would do, but you know in your heart that it's right. Think about your why. Think about why you got into education, and remember to keep the children at the center of everything that you do. If you get in good trouble because of them, then it's not really trouble. You're doing it for the greater good of everyone. And I really believe in that. That's what I'd say. That's what education should be about, causing good trouble for the good of our children and young people.
You're right. You're definitely right. And I guess another one of those two concepts is the difference between being anti-racist and not being racist.
Absolutely.
Can you just touch on that a bit and really explain what that means?
These are some really good questions, honestly. When we like to say we're not racist, but are you anti-racist? So you are, actively making sure that racism is not within your school. We know, unfortunately, that systemic discrimination exists. So if you start from that lens and say, right, okay, let me come from a place where we know that systemic discrimination exists, even if I haven't seen everything around it, what can I do to counteract those things? That's what anti-racism is about, being proactive rather than reactive, and making sure those measures are in place. So I would say to people, when you're thinking about your schools and what anti-racism truly looks like, how are you showing people that your schools are safe spaces and that people will have that sense of belonging in your school, not after something's happened?
And what sort of things can they do practically to look at that, like strategies and then tools and ideas to show that?
Well, I think some schools make the mistake of when they've got staff from marginalised backgrounds, they're like, oh, you can be in our DI group. The amount of listening exercises that I've been asked to go to, we just want to hear your opinion. And it gets on your nerves after a little while because you're just reliving your trauma all the time. It's doing your own research. There's no excuse for it now. AI, it's like people think it's sad. It's one of my best friends now.
Oh, me too. Me and ChatGPT are like this.
My favourite is Bing, Copilot Bing.
Yes, yeah.
Where I'm just like, what do you think about this? And they'll say, well, no, this isn't really a good thing to say, or this isn't a good thing to do. And what I like about Bing and Copilot over ChatGPT is it's using current websites. So ChatGPT is using, if you've got the old version, you haven't paid for the subscription, it's using its own knowledge and knowledge from a few years ago. With Copilot, it's getting information from websites and saying, this is the source of this information. So if you want to say, how do I truly show that I'm anti-racist? Don't ask me, ask Copilot, because otherwise you're just asking me again and again. And you're not so afraid to ask questions. There are certain things that will say, I'm not allowed to answer on this. And you're like, oh, what's going on there?
I pushed that one a bit too far.
I'll leave that. Or it will say, this is the end of this chat. I'm like, wow, I've really upset it, So it's just thinking about those questions you're afraid to ask people, just put it in ChatGPT, ChatGPT, Copilot, whatever.
Yeah.
If you're afraid that people are going to see your chat content, put it on private. Nobody will have to know. But just use it to ask those questions instead of a living person sometimes, so yeah.
And on that, there's been a conversation around, obviously, ChatGPT and others use the internet, inherent bias to produce their responses. What's your view on that, and how we can make sure that as that gets bigger and bigger, it doesn't further amplify the biases that already exist in society?
This is the thing. it's training itself from content. Okay, so if you're a school leader, what I would develop is your own kind of like chat GPT function. So you can get like a function that's fed into your school and just change it. So if it comes back with a response, I mean, for example, I'll give you a really silly example. I was writing something and on chat GPT now, it asks you to do a profile of yourself. So I said, Frances Akinde, I'm a SEND inspector and advisor. I've got a long history of, support in special schools, blah, blah, blah. And then I asked it something and it said, well, you should know that because you...
Excuse me?
Exactly. And I was like, that's a bit rude.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, I'm sorry. And I was like, excuse me, like, what's going on here? But you can train it. And you can train it in terms of those answers that are, the answers that you need it to have. So if it does say something that you think is filled with bias, then you need to say to it, that was a very biased answer. This is what this might look like, blah, blah, and it will change its answers. And so that's why it's really good to have a subscription or a login for it because it does train itself on the answers.
I think that's a really good point. I think sometimes people take the first iteration, but it's that back and forth. It's learning to use it. It's a tool.
Exactly.
And it's learning to how to use that tool.
Exactly. Absolutely. So, for example, I was doing some research around autism and the Mental Health Act because, there's this big campaign for autism not to be classed as a mental health condition. And, I was asking it questions about things and it was coming out with some really dodgy answers. And also I try and say autism or autistic spectrum condition rather than disorder. So I had to go back to it and say, we don't use those terms anymore, like Asperger's and things like that. So it was like, oh, sorry. And it improved its answer and did better. So
and learning from you
done.
Exactly. At the same time as well.
But it is quite sad because I will say, well done. It's like, oh, thank you.
Like a pat on the head, like a pat on its robot head. On that, actually, it's a really interesting conversation around mental health and neurodivergency.
Yeah.
How can those conversations be interlinked but also separated where they need to be separated?
It's such a good question. Again, a really good question. Because as school leaders, we know that, neurodivergence is something that we're talking about a lot with our students, but not so much with our staff. And we kind of ignore that our staff are going to be neurodivergent as well. It's kind of like this thing where we're like, right, children are neurodivergent. They're going to grow up into adults. And I don't think we recognize how many people are neurodivergent in education. We should be putting the same things in place that we do for our children and young people. So looking at accessibility features, thinking about our deadlines and how we communicate things and thinking, right, if I start from the lens of all my staff are neurodivergent and then putting things in place that will support everything, we will not see the burnout, we will not see the mental health needs that we have in education because a lot of people do not get a diagnosis until late.
Yeah.
So that, especially with women, you might see more anxiety, you might see more depression and things like that. And they might be misdiagnosed until they reach the menopause and then it's just ADHD and that is just so overwhelming. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, right, this might be ADHD, this might be autism. We're not doing enough in schools to think, how do we support our staff, and that's really, really important.
Especially with women, a lot of neurodivergent challenges come out later in life from masking and societal norms.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that maybe senior leadership can do to support women who they might notice some of the traits in but hasn't been diagnosed at that point?
Yeah, you know what? It's such an important question because we're too punitive. And that comes from our inspection system, that comes from our accountability. We don't take the time to say to somebody, are you okay? And that's one of the most important questions you can ask. I was really fortunate to do a mental health first aiders course. And every school leader should be a mental health first aider because it really teaches you to ask the right questions. And we kind of think, oh, we're being too soft. No, actually, our approach to wellbeing really needs to change. So when it comes to supporting staff, it's literally that conversation, are you okay? What do you need? It was so important to say, what do you need? How can I help you? And it automatically takes away that fear of saying, oh my gosh, I'm in a conversation with the school leader, with the head teacher, taking you right back to school when you were in trouble, and just reframing that conversation. A lot of the schools I work with now, they will not even mention observations or anything like that. It's supportive conversations, which I think is so important in terms of reframing that narrative. I was really fortunate to be part of the conversation with NEU and looking at Ofsted. and thinking about what those measures should be. If we didn't have such a punitive approach to school improvement, we wouldn't, as school leaders, feel that we had to, adopt that, way of being as well. So again, I hope that that changes so that we can be a bit more relaxed about the way we treat people.
And what reforms would you like to see with Ofsted?
Gosh, well, it
It's
depends
going to be
what
like
I
your
can say.
government list again, your policy list. But no, I think it's super important to talk about because obviously it's something that impacts every single person working in schools, and to a very large extent. I mean, we've seen some horrible, horrible tragedies due to this. And what is it you think needs to change and can change as well? Because
exactly. There are some things that I think will happen. So in terms of this whole notion of one-word judgments, they don't work. I mean, you're seeing a snapshot of what is happening in that school on that day. So it's thinking about how can you have that ongoing support. With the local authority I work for, we take a different approach to school improvement. So you have inspections twice a year. So you have like a full inspection where we look at all your data, we look at your school development plans and everything else. But it's a conversation around, okay, what's working well, what could be better, what are the next steps, and how can we support you with that? So we might send in like a subject specialist or a teaching and learning specialist or something like that. So it's a supportive approach. At the same time, as part of that, we do the head teacher's performance management. So we're having that ongoing dialogue. And then we come back 6 months later to check how schools are doing and say, right, how are you doing against your targets? And, we have a bespoke element that we agree with the schools. So there's things that we might be aware of that we say, right, this is a real concern that we're talking to school leaders about. But there's also areas that they say, right, I really want to improve my practice within that area. And it works. And that's why most of the schools are still under the local authority, because it works. I mean, it's not perfect. Nobody's perfect. But I think the danger is, though, if we go too far away from accountability. And regardless of what I've said about as part of the reforms and all that kind of stuff, I do believe in Ofsted because I do feel that there needs to be some outside scrutiny and accountability.
Well, I'll look forward to see if any of your policies and your ideas come to fruition.
I'll take personal credit for it.
Let's hope so. We like to finish the podcast with a quick fire round of questions. Number one, what do you think is the single biggest challenge facing education at the moment?
Traditionally, our model of education is set up for a certain demographic. And we can see that statistically. If you're a white middle-class male, with no neurodivergent conditions, no SEN needs, you're likely to do much better in education. If you're part of any other group, you're not. So what does that look like? We know that girls do better in girls' schools, but then boys do better in mixed schools. We know that children from marginalised ethnic backgrounds are not getting the results that they, should do. We know about mental health difficulties in SEN. We need a complete overhaul of what education looks like. We need to have a more hybrid model. We haven't learned. I mean, you got me started now. It's my favourite topic.
Go for it.
We haven't learned from the pandemic, and we kind of all came back into schools with this mass PTSD, and we did nothing about it. We were told, right, just go back into school. And everybody still needed that support. So we really need to think about how hybrid models work. The DfE have approved their first online schools. I think there's 2 of them now, which is absolutely amazing. Why can't we look at the model of education and think we need a more hybrid approach? What can we do as a more individualized approach for students? And sometimes that's a challenge if you're in a really big school. But then how schools get it right is they form like smaller communities, smaller schools within that school where people really have that relationship. And people forget relationships are the most fundamental things when it comes to behavior, when it comes to SEN. You have to start with relationships. And some people don't want to believe that, but it's true. You always remember that teacher that might have been strict with you. You might have thought you didn't like them, but you remember them for them getting you through education, and that support that they put in place for you. So we need to get back to relationships as the heart of education and that sense of belonging and inclusion.
And second question, what motivates you during your difficult days?
So I had, as a school leader, working in a SEN school, you are more likely to have children with life-limiting conditions. And unfortunately, I had 2 pupils that passed away in the same year. for me, it's really important to make sure that you've got support for yourself as a school leader and doing things you're passionate about. So my passion is art. I absolutely love art. So that's what my therapy is. I do art therapy, and I have an art therapist that I see, once a month. And she makes me make art.
Yeah.
A lot of the time as school leaders, we're just like, we don't have time. And whenever I do a talk, I always say to people, what is it that you loved to do when you were 10? You might not have had a very good childhood, but what was it that was your escape? Was it drawing? Was it singing? Was it music? Was it sport? Whatever it is, try and get back into that. And it's such an important thing for your well-being. So that's what gets me through really difficult times, thinking about my art and my faith as well, just thinking, right, I'm not here just for myself, and it's really important just to be mindful of that. So,
third question, what has been your proudest achievement in your career so far?
Gosh, there are so many. I've got 5 children, 5 boys, and having children, being a school leader at the same time, I think that's been a massive achievement, especially when it comes to headship and things like that. I think I've been really fortunate, or unfortunate really, until I became a head teacher, a senior leader, I was part-time and I had that flexibility. Unfortunately, when I became a school leader, that flexibility kind of went. I had to be full-time, and it's what the school needed. But actually, there are some great models now with school leadership where you've got job share, you've got a bit more flexibility, where people work from home one day a week and get things done. And I really think we need to look at that more as school leaders. What does flexibility look like? Can you imagine if I wasn't in education, it would be like a loss to everybody.
Huge loss, an absolutely huge loss.
And the only reason that I am in education is how flexible my job is now, I'm able to work from home a lot of the time. I'm able to like modify my diary to say, that doesn't work for me for travel, so I'm going to do that on that day. It's absolutely amazing, and I'm really fortunate to be in a position like that.
What are you most looking forward to in the next academic year?
Oh, I'm doing more inspections of independent schools. And like last year, I only had a few. This year, the local authority I work in, they've got this policy of inspecting every school where there's a child. And it's absolutely amazing to learn, so much good practice from so many different schools. I'm really looking forward to that. I'm really, really looking forward to my book coming out. I need to plug that. Like, can't get through the whole podcast without that.
Tell us about the book. Tell us about the book.
So the book's called Be an Ally, Not a Bystander. Yeah. And it really is about the difference between true allyship and performative allyship. And what I thought was really important is we don't speak to children young enough about allyship and what that really looks like. So I really wanted to create a resource, and it's aimed at primary school teachers, educators, and children. And it's basically a journey that they have together around what is it that they need to do themselves. So the book, each chapter is in 2 parts, where there's a bit for educators to look at themselves, and then there's activities to do in the classroom, and then there's stuff around policy and things like that. So I've tried to cover everything, and I really want it to be used as like a whole school resource and really to affect change and really think, how can we make sure that we're truly preparing our students to be global citizens and really be inclusive people, and how can we have that sense of belonging in our schools? And it started off from workshops that I was doing in schools when I left headship, and they were just so moving to get children to talk about, in a safe space, talk about some of the difficulties they were having within allyship, and getting them to show up for each other. And I absolutely loved it. It's one of the, like you said, actually, what's the best thing you've done? That was one of the best things that I did. And I thought, you know what, if I've got a way to share that on a wider scale, then so be it.
Thank you so much for coming on today. It's been such an inspirational and interesting conversation. Like, the work you do is super important. And I think in a time when people are struggling with funding and ideas, like, a lot of what you said is going to help so many people who are listening today.
Thank you so much. That's the whole point of being here. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening, and thank you very much to Frances for joining us today. To find out more about how The Key can support your trust, please visit thekeysupport.com/trust. For more information about Frances, links to relevant resources and information on how to subscribe to the Trust Matters monthly newsletter, read the description below. If you enjoyed this episode, please do like and subscribe or leave us a review.